All right, guys, so this video again is a continuation for graphing of trig functions. For trig, this is coming from 5.6 and for pre-cal from 4.6. So we're going to talk about the cosecant and secant graphs in this video. So if you have not seen our first video where we talk about how to draw these, make sure to check that out first. Here, cosecant. Who is cosecant the flip-flop of? Right, this is me flipping sine, which means I'm going to do this entire graph as if I was drawing sine. Okay? I also have this as a negative, so it's like I'm going to draw a negative sine graph. Okay, so I will end up drawing a negative sine graph. And then remember, I'll end up doing the 3 asymptotes and then flipping. Okay, you don't have to draw this. I like to do it. So at the end, once my brain is done focusing on all the math, I know what it's supposed to look like, okay? My amplitude is 3. My cycle is 2 pi over b, which happens to also be 2 pi. So my cycle is going to be 1. Okay? My horizontal shift, this is a plus sign, so opposite the sign would be negative. And then c over b, 4 over 2 pi, which reduces to negative 2 over pi. Do not be afraid of having that pi in the bottom, okay? We are going to work with that pi in the bottom, and it's going to be okay to leave it looking a little messy. So remember that horizontal shift is also your first point, negative 2 over pi. Okay? Vertical shift, there's no d here, so I don't have any, which means that my midline is at the x-axis. Increment is 1/4 times your cycle, so it just leaves me at 1/4. Okay? Now, I'm going to grab my previous point, negative 2 over pi, plus my increment, which is 1/4. Don't let that pi throw you off. I need a common denominator, which means on this left side, I need to multiply by what? Exactly. And on this right side, what am I going to have to multiply by? Yep. Perfect. Pi. So what I'm working with now is negative 2 times 4 is negative 8 over 4 pi plus pi over 4 pi. Okay? So this value here, remember this is my increment, but just containing the common denominator. Okay? So instead of adding 1/4, I'm going to keep adding for the rest of these 5 increments that pi over 4 pi. Okay? So the rest shouldn't be too bad. Negative 8 plus pi, I'm going to leave that as a negative 8 plus pi over 4 pi. Okay? Don't be afraid to leave it messy. Now, previous point, negative 8 plus pi over 4 pi. I'm going to add another pi. So if I add another pi to this, what do you think that numerator is going to look like? Exactly, negative 8 plus 2 pi over the 4 pi. So I'm adding pi over 4 pi, which is my increment. Okay? So if I just look at the numerator, I have negative 8 plus pi, which gives me negative 8 plus 2 pi over 4 pi. Grab the previous answer, and hopefully you start to get an idea. What do you think the next answer is going to look like? Exactly. The numerator is going to have a negative 8 plus 3 pi. So just because it looks ugly does not mean it has to be a difficult problem, okay? Very good question. Would the negative 8 make the points positive or negative? So, in my pre-calc class, I would make you go through the thought process on your own. On your trig class, I would let you use a calculator, but I'm going to walk you through both, okay? So, remember pi is like 3.14. So, negative 8 plus 3 point something would still be negative. Double 3 point something would be 6 point something. Negative 8 plus 6 point something would be positive or negative? Negative. Now 3 times 3 point something would be 9 point something. So negative 8 plus 9 point something would end up being. So in here, somewhere in here is where I switch from negative to positive. Does that make sense? Now, in a trig class, I would allow you to put these fractions in your calculator so that you can check whether the decimal were positive or negative. Okay? So now let's go ahead and go to our drawing. So I'm going to have 1, 2, 3 points on the negative side. Okay? And then 2 points on the positive side. So first thing that we draw is our midline. In this question, the midline stays on the x-axis. My amplitude is 3, so I'm going to go up 3 and down to negative 3. Next are my 5 points. Again, I have 3 of them in the negative and 2 of them in the positive. Okay? And now the last part. Okay, this is the part that should be new. Because this is cosecant, I'm going to draw, because it's a negative cosecant, I'm going to draw dotted or dashed a negative sign. Okay, so pretend it's a sign, but when you connect the dots, draw it dashed. And I say dashed because technically it's not part of our actual image. So sine starts the first point at the midline. The second point comes down to the minimum, back to the midline, up to the maximum, and back to the midline. All right, you see how I drew a negative sine graph dashed? All right, so in our notes in the first video, we said that whenever we are working with a cosecant or secant function, my next 2 steps is to draw asymptotes at the midline. I hit the midline 1, 2, and 3 times. So here's my asymptote on the first one. So I might go a little bit into my work there. And then the second thing we said on a secant or cosecant is to flip the parabola. So this is going to flip downward. And this one that's parabola, it looks like it's facing downward, is going to flip upward. Okay? So, doesn't matter how pretty your drawing looks. As long as your values are correct, guys, you will get full credit for this. All right, so let's check out this secant graph. So because secant is the reciprocal, the flip-flop of cosine, we're going to end up drawing a cosine graph. And it's positive, so we're going to draw a positive cosine graph. Amplitude is 2. Cycle is 2 pi divided by b. My b also happens to be 2. Those 2's reduce, and I just end up with pi, okay? Horizontal shift is negative here, so I'm going to be positive. And it is c, which is pi over 2, divided by b, okay? When I work that out, dividing fractions, you multiply by the reciprocal, or some of us remember keep, change, flip, and I end up with pi over 4, okay? My horizontal shift is also my first of my 5 points, okay? Vertical shift, I have a -3, so that is going to be my midline. And my increments is 1/4 of my cycle, which is pi. So pi over 4. Okay. It is a good day when my horizontal shift and my increments already have a common denominator. So if I started at pi over 4, I'm going to add my increment of pi over 4. Do not need to get common denominator. And I end up with 2 pi over 4. Hopefully you do not feel the need to do any work here, guys. Because 2 pi over 4 plus another pi over 4 is, and the next one will be 4 pi over 4. And the next one, 5. Does that make sense? I'll do the work for your notes.
In this one for the graph, always remember the positive side of the x-axis.
All right, so as we go now to draw our graph, we see that all of our 5 points are positive. So I can draw my y-axis all the way to the left. The first thing that I draw is my midline. My midline is at -3. Okay. Then my amplitude is 2, which means I'm going to go 2 up. If I go 2 up from -3, where do I land at? Good. And then if I go 2 down, where do I land? -5. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and write my 5 points. And now, because this is a secant, I'm going to draw this as a positive cosine. Okay? Positive cosines on their first point start at the maximum. Second point, go to midline. Third point, go to the minimum. Fourth, back to the midline. And fifth point, back to the maximum. Now, remember, this is a secant, so the cosine that I'm drawing is going to be dashed. And like in our notes in our first video, our next step is to draw asymptotes on the midlines. Notice that cosines only hit the midline twice. So I should only have 2 vertical asymptotes. And then my next step is just to bounce off the parabolas. The middle one is really easy to see. Okay. The top two, this is like half of a parabola facing down. So I'm going to draw half of a parabola facing up. Same thing here. This would be half of a parabola facing down. So I'm going to draw this right side of the parabola facing up. And you are done with your secant graph.